Great to see you here as we prepare to go before the Lord in His house with the study of His Word. If you would take your Bibles and open them to Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 1. We're going to be in the first 9 verses of this chapter today. All right, so who's been reading through this book? Good. If you've been reading through it recently, you probably noticed that the second chapter follows the first one very closely. If you remember, the key verse of chapter 1, or the key verses, were 13 and 14. If you would look back at those for just a second. Chapter 1 and verses 13 and 14. Solomon said, "I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. This sore travail hath God given to the sons of man to be exercised therewith. I have seen all the works that were done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation and spirit." And you'll see that that word all appears 3 times in those 2 verses. And so the phrases I want you to pay attention to are all things, all the works, and all is vanity. We learn that the king's objective was to make an examination of anything and everything that men might do under the sun. And Solomon, he was uniquely qualified to conduct this investigation. We've discussed that. You should also know that all of the activities that we're going to look at in the first verses of chapter 2, they all fit under the heading of vanity and vexation of spirit. Last Sunday we spoke about how this phrase, vexation of spirit, it refers to the persistent turmoil of heart and soul that all men have as a consequence of the curse, a lack of peace, a lack of meaning. Because no matter what I might pour my efforts into, a life that's detached from God is ultimately unsatisfying. It's ultimately meaningless, and it's ultimately nothing but vanity. This truth is likely what the Apostle Paul had in mind when he wrote Romans 8:20. He observed that the creature was made subject to vanity. The passage also states that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain. Some of the same language that's used back in Ecclesiastes for the very same reasons. This is a very familiar verse to most of us, but don't miss that important connection that it has with Ecclesiastes. The groaning and the suffering that's referenced in Romans, it's a specific and it's a lasting consequence of the curse. Men and their environment are now subject to the painful effects of Adam and Eve's failure, because the consequences of their disobedience, they're vast. They encompass everything. One of the things dealt with in the book of Ecclesiastes is mankind's tendency to try to alleviate the effects of the curse with his own human skill and ingenuity. This ungodly mission continues to the present day, but attempts to lessen the painful reality of a life separated from the Creator, they show up very early. In fact, so early in our history that Adam and Eve were still living. Genesis chapter 4 mentions 3 brothers, all born to a man named Lamech. Lamech was of the wicked line of Cain. He was the 4th generation, the great-great-great-great-grandson of Adam. Lamech was also a bit of a pioneer in perversion. He is the first that the Bible records as having taken 2 wives. The 3 brothers born from his sinful union were named Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain. Quite the trio, Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal. These brothers, the scripture tells us, were also pioneers in several ways. Jabal is designated as the father of such as dwell in tents and of such as have cattle. His younger brother, Jubal, is named as the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. And their half-sibling, Tubal-Cain, is recognized as an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. And those 3 big spheres of human activity would go on to have a tremendous impact on the world. And their influence is still around us today. It's seen in this world's devotion to music, industry, and craftsmanship. And wouldn't you know it, what began back in Genesis is also what's addressed in Ecclesiastes and in the verses we just read out of Romans. Paul recognized the very things that Solomon investigated. The primary means that men, rebels against God, will try to use to soothe the unpleasant effects of the curse. So as we read the text for today, see if you can identify what I'm talking about. Music, entertainment, industry, business, Lamech's lasting legacy. Verse 1 of chapter 2 says, "I said in mine heart, Go to now, I will prove thee with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure, and behold, this also is vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth it? I sought in mine heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainting mine heart with wisdom, and to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was that good for the sons of men, which they should do unto the heaven all the days of their life. I made me great works, I builded me houses, I planted me vineyards, I made me gardens and orchards, and I planted trees in them of all kinds of fruits. I made me pools of water, to water therewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. I got me servants and maidens, and had servants born in my house. Also I had great possessions of great and small cattle, above all that were in Jerusalem before me. I gathered me also silver and gold, and the peculiar treasure of kings and of provinces. I gat me men singers and women singers, and the delights of the sons of men, as musical instruments, and that of all sorts. So I was great, and increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Now it's apparent as we read through this passage that King Solomon, he's giving us a concise summary of his entire life. All of the temporal activities and works that he invested in are on full display for us. Why? So that we might understand that when the king says, all is vanity, he's making a statement born from personal experience. You see, it's one thing to have a theoretical head knowledge of biblical truth. It's another thing entirely to have actually lived it out. So it's also important to understand the context of this section. It's a historical narrative. Solomon is sharing his life with us. Though there is much we can learn here, the purpose of these verses is not primarily to teach a doctrinal truth. It exists to provide necessary details about what the king has learned from his application of truth. The Bible is always practical, and scriptural truth always goes along with personal application and also experience. I tell you that simply so you'll keep this text in proper context and understand we need to view it as evidence, a proof that the instruction revealed in this book is reliable. And obviously we know that it is because it is the Word of God, but we do also see Solomon's experience here. So before we go through this verse by verse, I also want to call your attention to another point of clarification. You'll notice the phrase, yet acquainting my heart with wisdom, in verse 3. If you haven't found it, take a second and read until you see it. Yet acquainting my heart with wisdom. Now skip down to verse 9. There you will see a similar phrase at the end of the verse. It says, also my wisdom remained with me. Two mentions of wisdom in the midst of a great deal of human activity. And we learned back in chapter 1 that Solomon had given his heart to seek and search out by wisdom. That is very crucial. Throughout chapter 2, though chapter 2 describes many of his personal experiences, we need to understand that the king did not live his life just like every other man. Besides his supernatural wisdom, Solomon's objective and his purpose in recording these activities was also unique. He wasn't just simply saying, here's what I've done, let me brag on myself for a while. There's a reason why he's writing these things down. The king examined all of the works of men in the light of what he knew about the Lord. And this is very different from the experience of the natural man. Though the lost may be able to recognize the vanity and futility of their existence, and though they experience the fading glory of their own accomplishments, the unsaved have no knowledge as to why this is so. They don't know why. Many scholars and philosophers have recognized exactly the same vexation of spirit that Solomon did, but unlike the writer of Ecclesiastes, those that have no vision of anything higher also have no real answers to that dilemma at all. Pantheists look for meaning in nature. Confucianists try to fulfill human duties. Cynicists strive for self-sufficiency. Hedonists live for pleasure. Plato, a famous philosopher, tried to answer the question by seeking knowledge. Epicurus said that life was about freeing oneself from pain. Aristotle's advice was just to be a good person. And Stoicism pursues perfection through reason. And as you go through all these different philosophies throughout history, they all recognize it. They don't have an answer for it. They're all trying to answer the same question. What is the point of all of this? So when Solomon mentions his wisdom twice in this text, he's telling us that though he pursued many of the same things as his peers, he did not abandon his wisdom while he did so. The reason why Ecclesiastes is ultimately able to give us the answer to the question is because Solomon's search was carried out by wisdom. Though he was not a perfect man, and he failed miserably in many areas, we should regard what we read in these verses very highly. We should recognize that the investigation taking place here was and still is unprecedented. No other man has ever poured himself into such things and still come away with an answer to all of it. All right, with that as a bit of an introduction and some notes on the context, let's take a deeper look at the 5 different areas of human activity that are given to us in this text. The first point comes to us from verses 1 and 2, where it says, I said in mine heart, go to now, I will prove thee with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure, and behold, this also is vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth it? Number 1, Solomon proved his heart with mirth. The first thing we learned here is that the king, he took a hard look at the lighter side of life. Now, the word mirth to us usually means humor or laughter. Though this is not too far off, the Hebrew word that it's translated from, simha, I don't know if I'm pronouncing any of these correctly, actually means joy, gladness, or rejoicing. The word pleasure mentioned in the same verse is an adjective that simply means good. So what we have revealed here in verse 1 is primarily an attitude of the heart. Unsurprisingly then, Solomon says that he will prove his heart with mirth and pleasure, and to prove something is to test it. The king has directed his wise heart to test the quality of this attitude. Now at this point I'll ask you as an audience, is there anything wrong with what's described here? Is there anything sinful about having gladness of heart or rejoicing? Now, some might immediately say, no, that's actually a very good attitude to have about life. Others maybe are not quite so sure. We'll come back to that question in a moment. Look at verse 2. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth it? Now that word laughter, it's pretty interesting. It comes from the Hebrew word sekoke. Though it does mean exactly what it says in English, laughter, it's also translated as mocking or derision in the Bible. In fact, out of the 15 times it's used, it's translated as laughter 6 times and derision 5 times. Job 12:4 gives us one of the best senses of what I believe Solomon meant when he used this word. Job declared, I am as one mocked of his neighbor, who calleth upon God, and he answereth him. The just upright man is laughed to scorn. Those words mocked and scorn are the same word that's used in Ecclesiastes. Interesting. So Solomon, it appears, is not just referring to laughter in general, but to a very specific kind of mirth. Derision is defined as ridicule or mockery, and it always accompanies an attitude of contempt. Now, wouldn't you know it? I was just speaking with one of the men of our church a couple weeks ago about the whole attitude of mockery and ridicule, the one, that's so prevalent in our society today. We were talking about what the Christian's attitude should be about things like derision, mockery, and sarcasm. And overwhelmingly, when the Bible speaks on the subject of mocking or refers to those that it calls mockers, it's talking about a lost person, and not just any lost person, one that has hardened his heart against the truth. Mocking and derision are chief characteristics of the lost. An attitude of contempt towards others that would lead a person to ridicule or scoff is also a very evil thing. During our conversation, I pointed out that we do see some examples of men employing ridicule and even sarcasm in some of their arguments. Paul, in recognizing the absurdity of the Athenians' unknown gods, or what about the prophet Elijah, in highlighting the foolishness and the self-harm brought about by the worship of Baal. There are times when the sheer absurdity of idolatry should be exposed, absolutely. But these legitimate uses is not what Solomon is referring to. Ultimately, an appropriate application of ridicule and sarcasm, it's never going to include this attitude of contempt. And certainly it will never be used for the purpose of entertainment. That's the main difference drawn out here in Ecclesiastes. Because laughter is not an intrinsically evil thing. Neither is joy, rejoicing, or gladness. But when each of these things are engaged in apart from the lordship of Christ, they can and they frequently do become evil practices. At best, the mirth and laughter of this world, it's an utterly useless waste of time. At worst, It's one method that men frequently use to try to lighten their situation, to alleviate their terribly sinful condition. Have you ever been digging in with somebody in a Bible study, getting right down to really where you needed to go, and they respond with some type of flippant type of comment or laughter? That's what I'm talking about. It can divert the mind and the heart from what the real issue is here. So Solomon, he tested his heart with the gladness of the world, and as he said in verse 1, it brought him nothing but emptiness and heaviness. And in fact, Proverbs 14:13, which he also wrote, says, even in laughter the heart is sorrowful, and the end of that mirth is heaviness. Do you know what comes before and after that verse? Proverbs 14:12 says, there is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. And then verse 14 says, the backslider in heart shall be filled with his own ways, and a good man shall be satisfied from himself. So again, remember, we're talking about some different strategies that fallen men use to try to deal with the negative effects of the curse. And the lesson here, as Solomon experienced firsthand, is that man cannot be truly satisfied with himself. Verse 2 says that laughter is mad. This, no doubt, is a reference back to chapter 1 and verse 17, which said, and I gave my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly. Laughter is not insanity, but when it rises no higher than to mock or deride, it's a truly sinful and useless thing. So what practical guidance can we take from these first two verses? Well, I'm not saying that laughter is a bad thing or something that should be avoided by any means. You should know me well enough to know I love to laugh, and I also love it when other people laugh. I've looked in the mirror enough times to know the Lord also has a good sense of humor. But the example here is still very important. We need to remember that though laughter and gladness and joy are all wonderful gifts from God, they must always be the result of our walk with Him. They're not the objective. They're never the goal. We serve God and we serve others not because of what it brings us, but because of what He has done for us. Because when you disconnect rejoicing, joy, gladness, and laughter from this higher purpose, it becomes nothing more than a worthless, worldly celebration of ourselves. This is what Solomon is dealing with. It's no surprise that in such a context, laughter would easily dissolve into derision and even mockery. When the enjoyment is all about me, I tend towards contempt of others. The other thing this teaches us is that, folks, not all laughter is created equally. Any humor that is designed to cruelly tear down people while lifting myself up is wicked. It's sinful. Any laughter that's engaged in with a contemptuous and disrespectful attitude is also sinful. We enjoy laughing at life, at one another's quirks, and at humorous situations. But we need to be very careful not to cross the line and fall into the Bible's definition of mockery. There are some things that must never, ever be laughed at or laughed about. Though it is not inappropriate to include some humor in our preaching and teaching, these things must be used very sparingly, and they must never be allowed to detract from or replace the truth of God's word in any way. We do not make light of God or of the things of God. This is the very definition of blasphemy. Another characteristic of the lost, because joking about the Lord is no laughing matter. Now, Solomon will go on to give this very serious warning in chapter 5. Keep thy foot when thou goest to the house of God, and be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they consider not that they do evil. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou upon earth. Therefore let thy words be few. So as we see the king proved his heart with mirth, let us be very careful not to use laughter, a gift from God, inappropriately. And most important, don't ever selfishly limit your gladness and joy to only those things that happen here under the sun. God Himself is the source of all true joy, goodness, and rejoicing. All right, let's move to verse 3. The next category of temporal activity. The text says, I sought in my heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainting my heart with wisdom, and to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was that good for the sons of men, which they should do unto the heaven all the days of their life. So following on the heels of the internal attitude mentioned in verse 1 and 2, we have a more external pursuit in verse 3, and really it'll be more external throughout the rest of the passage. Point number 2 is that Solomon proved his heart with wine. Now, before we go into this, how many of you know that there are several different words used to describe wine and products made from grapes in the Bible? I'm getting some good nods from everybody. Now, we don't have time to go into this in much detail, but broad strokes, we hold to what's called a two-wine view here at True North Baptist Church. And that means that we believe, it's pretty simple really, that the words used to describe the product of the grape need to be understood in the original context where they're actually found. In the Old Testament, there are two words that are used frequently to describe various kinds of substances made from grapes. The word sakar, which means and always refers to strong drink or a highly intoxicating liquid, and the much more common word yayin. Yayin is used 140 times, and it's translated into English every time as simply wine. But depending on where you find in the Old Testament, it can either refer to intoxicating wine or to just your regular fresh squeezed orange juice. You have to look at the context to figure out which one is being referred to. And so that brings us to Solomon's statement, I sought in my heart to give myself unto wine. So this can mean one of two things. The one wine view, that is, every time you see wine in the Old Testament, it refers to an alcoholic drink, would have to say that what he's describing here is him going on a drunken binge. But I think we have several good reasons to believe that Solomon did not, in fact, get hammered for the purposes of his investigation. Remember, all of the efforts in this book were ruled by wisdom. And wisdom characteristically is something that is exercised by a sober and focused mind. The word for wine in this verse is yayin, and I believe that Solomon enjoyed the fresh product of the grape here for two main reasons. The first is because Solomon was the king in Jerusalem. As the king of Israel, Solomon clearly recognized that a lack of sobriety in leadership would bring about disastrous results. In Proverbs 31:4 and 5, Solomon wrote, It is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes strong drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. Now clearly he's referring to alcoholic wine there. That's why it's so important to look at the context. And yet in the Song of Solomon, chapter 4 and verse 10, the same king says, How fair is thy love, my sister, my spouse? How much better is thy love than wine? Now, either he's contradicting himself or we're dealing with two kinds of wine. Solomon clearly was not in favor of alcoholic wine, and under inspiration he also wrote Proverbs 23:31. Look not thou upon the wine when it is red, when it giveth his color in the cup, when it moveth itself aright. The second reason is the phrase I already drew your attention to earlier, yet acquainting mine heart with wisdom. This is a parenthetical clause. In other words, even though Solomon explored the pros and cons, the benefits of sensual pleasures like joy, gladness, and wine, he never did so without also exercising a high degree of wisdom and self-control. The very fact that he retained his wisdom and understanding in the midst of his experiment proves he did not drink alcoholic wine and become intoxicated, because wisdom and inebriation, they're not compatible things. But Solomon did. He did explore the attractions of the table. Wine, no doubt banqueting and food and all manner of physical delights, and yet he never lost control of himself, because his purpose was to discover if there was in these things any real good which might satisfy men's cravings and be something worthy for them to pursue all the days of their life. That's what he says in the verse. Again, in keeping with the first two verses, the fruits of the vine, the results of your labor, food, pleasure, and enjoyment, these things are not intrinsically sinful. It is lawful and appropriate for a Christian to enjoy blessings that God has bestowed. Asceticism and purposely denying oneself what God has specifically authorized for our consumption and enjoyment, it's not a result of spirituality. It's actually a symptom of pride. But even though God's blessings are wonderful and they bring us a level of satisfaction, we have to remember Solomon's point. What if we made no connection to God when we considered our many blessings and benefits, even physical ones? What if our perspective was entirely earthbound and completely selfish? That's the default view of the natural man. He makes no connection at all between the grace showered on him and the God of all grace. I was thinking about this week while I was in Anchorage, because every day of the conference I was at, we would have a lunch brought in, right? And so there's 350 police officers, like a stampeding herd of rhinos headed for that food, No thought in their minds whatsoever of thanking the Lord for it, or slowing down a little bit, of moderation. Nothing. It's just me, 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 me. That's the type of attitude I'm talking about here. There's no link. There's no connection there. Do temporal pleasures like wine satisfy? Solomon hasn't answered that question explicitly, but we can say with certainty, no, they don't. All physical blessings, just like the attitude of joy itself, they were meant to flow from a relationship with God. Again, they're the result. They're not the goal. Solomon gave himself to such things for the purpose of determining their worth. We should trust the results of his study and allow them to guide our own lives. Now, this morning we're talking about some of the things that King Solomon explored during his search for meaning. And we have to move pretty quickly through the text so we can hopefully get it wrapped up today. The next point is found in verses 4 through 6. Solomon states, I made me great works, I builded me houses, I planted me vineyards, I made me gardens and orchards, and I planted trees in them of all kinds of fruits. I made me pools of water, to water wherewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. Industry, building projects, and some great achievements. And our third point is that Solomon proved his heart with business. Besides efforts to satisfy themselves with laughter and wine, fallen men, they often try to mitigate the pain of the curse through business ventures and grand personal accomplishments. Here Solomon moves away from self-indulgence and he begins to pursue all the things that a man's skill can produce and his money can buy. I don't have to tell you that his resources were basically unlimited and his power was unmatched. He provides a very good perspective for any earthly project or goal that we might set for ourselves. If you read through the Old Testament, you'll see that Solomon, he truly had a passion for magnificent buildings. His building projects are mentioned in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. He spent 13 years on a huge palace for himself and also commissioned a royal retreat to be built in the forest of Lebanon. This house included pillars of cedar, a porch of pillars, and a hall of judgment. There were also many fortresses, store cities, chariot towns, and cities in distant lands that he founded. The text tells us that Solomon also had many vineyards, orchards, and gardens. His father David had built vineyards and olive yards that were passed into his possession when he took the crown. Solomon's love of gardens appears throughout all of his writings. He had a king's garden on the slope of the hills south of the city and another about 6 miles east of Jerusalem. The word orchard used here actually means a park. These parks were planted with forest and fruit trees, and they often contained large herds of animals. Verse 6 also tells us that Solomon made himself pools of water to supply those parks and vineyards that he had built. The most famous example of this is the water supply at Etham, a city southwest of Bethlehem. There are 3 pools there, ranging from 582 feet long to about 200 feet wide and anywhere from 25 to 50 feet deep. His works and his projects were extensive, far beyond anything that any one of us individually will produce. And yet Solomon quickly learned the same things that you also discover when you start getting projects done and building things. None of those things can really satisfy you. None of them can measure up to a relationship with the Lord. In fact, many of them bring a whole lot of irritation and trouble into your life. Ultimately, all of the accomplishments and clever things we might produce, if they only exist in this physical plane, they're going to pass away and be destroyed. Solomon will go on to talk about the frustration of knowing that all of your hard-earned satisfaction will not only not last, but it will be swiftly devoured by others as soon as you pass away. Because none of us really own anything. We just use the environment that God's given to us while we're here for a very brief time. As it relates to personal stewardship, this is a pretty important thing to remember. There's nothing wrong with enjoying the things that you've made or the fruits of your labor in this life. They're blessings from God. But don't you over-invest in worldly projects. Don't allow them to captivate your mind and your heart and take up all of your time. As you carry out even things you might enjoy doing, make sure to acquaint your heart with wisdom like Solomon did. Maintain a good, godly perspective on your works. The lost can't do this. What they can make and produce and achieve, it's the most important thing to them. And if you doubt this, spend about 5 minutes talking to a lost person. Because all they talk about is their plans for this life and the satisfaction that they hope to get out of it. It's always very concerning to me when people claiming to be Christians only talk about such things. We that are saved are not separated from the Lord. Therefore, our vision should and must be higher than every building project and every accomplishment. We must be careful to steward our hearts and our hands so that we might honor the Lord with our works. Now, moving down into the last 3 verses, we can see a few final things that Solomon poured his heart and his efforts into. Though we can pick out some specific points, I'm going to read these together because they're connected with each other and the other verses we've already discussed. The king says, I got me servants and maidens, and had servants born in my house. Also I had great possessions of great and small cattle above all that were in Jerusalem before me. I gathered me also silver and gold and the peculiar treasure of kings and of the provinces. I got me men singers and women singers, and the delights of the sons of men as musical instruments and that of all sorts. So I was great, and increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Now besides entertainment, wine, and business, what else do men try to use to divert themselves, to bring some measure of satisfaction in this world? Well, in these verses we see that number 4, Solomon proved his heart with relationships, and he also proved his heart with possessions. The king gathered unto himself, it says, servants and maidens, and had servants born in his house. This descriptor, in my house, indicates a close relationship between Solomon's attendants and his family. These were not slaves or merely conquered enemies, but men and women and their children that lived under Solomon's protection and served the king faithfully. So this text is not merely speaking of the benefits of having someone that serves you, but of the relationships that go along with having such an individual that's living in your house. Relationships are an area that men frequently have tried to use to find satisfaction and meaning in life. They are also a welcome diversion from the pain of an existence that's alienated from God. You've probably noticed at this point that nothing we've talked about in and of itself is wrong. But each of these areas, each pursuit can quickly become once detached from spiritual reality. Human relationships, they're a gift from God. They can truly be a blessing and an encouragement because we were not designed to live alone and in isolation. But the fulfillment brought by an earthly relationship, it's a temporary and fleeting thing. Relationships are also very powerful. They can demand massive amounts of time and energy, and they have the potential, they will greatly affect the people that are engaged in them. On the one hand, you are free to enjoy edifying and lawful relationships with one another. On the other hand, we have to be very careful whenever allowing our relationships to become our all-encompassing concern. And that's a very special danger when the relationship is a very close one. Husband and wife, brother and sister, child or grandparent. As meaningful as these connections are to us, they are always limited by our life under the sun. They were never designed to bring permanent satisfaction, and they were certainly not given to men that we might hide from the effects of our sin in the pleasure and distraction of good company. Relationships must be carefully managed and stewarded, lest they begin to take away from what's reserved for the Lord. Now, there is definitely hope here as well for the Christian. Though the lost are forced to carry on relationships with no higher purpose, the saved are actually intended to form relationships around this higher purpose. We have good godly relationships, not as the end-all goal, but as the result of our communion with the Lord. Just like in these other categories, the blessing of a good relationship must be a byproduct, not the objective. We serve the Lord first and foremost, and as we do so, he brings people alongside us to share in the work. In the end, this is the only way such relationships can have any lasting meaning at all. Because without this, every relationship is merely two selfish people trying to get what they want out of the other person. Now, as we wind this down, you'll see one more thing that Solomon mentions in verse 8. He states, I gathered me also silver and gold and the peculiar treasure of kings and of the provinces. Solomon proved his heart with possessions. That's our last point. The title of this message today, by the way, is I Tried All the Things. And try everything King Solomon did. You probably also noticed him talking about male and female singers and musical instruments. I'm not addressing this portion directly for sake of time, but it very much goes along with the mirth and the laughter that was mentioned back in verse 1. Entertainment, music and entertainment have always been chief methods that men try to use to improve their lives. There's nothing wrong with good music, but the same rules of stewardship apply. But this verse is talking about Solomon's possessions, right? His treasure, silver and gold. We mentioned in the introduction to this series the incredible wealth of Israel during this man's reign. Truly, King Solomon was well equipped to tell us whether these things have any lasting value. I can only imagine an ad showing up in his mailbox for the man that has everything. Though it's connected with the business and industry already mentioned, the possessions of Solomon are a category of their own. He had everything a person could possibly dream of, and yet we'll find that merely amassing material things is probably the most unsatisfying pursuit of all. The world lies to unbelievers and believers alike, trying to convince men that true, lasting happiness is found in what they can acquire. I mean, look at our country. This is what the vast majority of people profess to believe, even though, if you ask any wealthy person, it doesn't work. The more you have, the more unhappy you become, because even though you might try to use physical possessions to solve spiritual problems, they can only ever leave you empty and wanting more. Our consumer culture plays into this by convincing people that if they only had the next big thing, they'd be set. They'd finally be happy. The perspective in this text is limited to those things that might be acquired while living here on this earth. There's no consideration of the spiritual. I mean, sometime when you're home, just sit there, find a chair, sit down, look around, and imagine if what you had in your house was really all you had. What a horribly empty existence that would be. This is what Solomon's example can teach us. You really don't have to buy everything to find it out for yourself. You just have to read God's word. Possessions like laughter, business, and relationships must be very carefully controlled and stewarded. Though having things is not wrong in and of itself, replacing spiritual satisfaction with what we can acquire and surround ourselves with is an incredibly sinful and foolish thing. People with houses absolutely stuffed to the brim and yet suffering terrible spiritual poverty. As Christians, we have the immense benefit of looking beyond the perspective offered by Ecclesiastes. Solomon is listing these different categories for a special purpose. A lost person reading this book is intended to think, well, I've tried that, and that, and that as well. I don't get any lasting meaning from it, and neither did the fellow that wrote this book. Ultimately, though this section of Scripture is not intended to be doctrinal, it does teach us about some of the common traps and pitfalls that we as Christians can fall into if we're not careful. The main application for us then, though we don't initially come to laughter, business, relationships, wine, or possessions like the lost man does, we better not give up our spiritual sight and start acting like one. The last thing that Solomon said in verse 9 was, "So I was great and increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me." So as we close this message and we move into the next one, and we go out of this place to live the lives that God has ordained, this text leaves us with a very important question. Though we may be great, though we may have increase, though we might have many blessings and joy and laughter and worthwhile projects and good food and loving relationships and useful possessions, does our wisdom also remain with us? Do we still have a spiritual priority and perspective even in the midst of all of it? Are we carefully stewarding our attitude, verse 1, our appetites, verse 3, our industry, verse 4, 5, and 6, our relationships, verse 7, and our belongings, verse 8? May God help us to do so and to be men and women that never forget the source of all such things. For if we do forget, if we take our eyes off what really matters, even a blessing can become nothing more than vanity and vexation of spirit. James 1:16 through 18 says, "Do not err, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning." This is the key, though. "Of his own will begot he us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures." Let's pray.